Hey, it's Rick Mulready here. Thanks so much for listening to the Inside Social Media Podcast. Really appreciate it. Want to take a second to quickly give you a heads up that I've started a brand new podcast called The Art of Paid Traffic, and that's where I'm putting all of my focus right now. That's the show where I bring you the best tips, tactics, and strategies for using paid traffic to grow your business on autopilot. You'll also hear what's working and not working right now from the top minds in online marketing so that you can get more leads and sales every day without having to empty your wallet in the process. So I invite you to come over, have a listen to The Art of Paid Traffic. Just search in the search field, whether it's iTunes or Stitcher, search on The Art of Paid Traffic, and I will also see you over on that show. Now here's today's episode. The Corcoran Group's Matthew Shadbolt is my guest this week on the Inside Social Media Podcast. And man, is this episode ever chock full of actionable content as we're talking big brand strategies for small business budgets. Let's do this. Hey, what's up? I'm Rick Mulready, and welcome to episode number 12 of the Inside Social Media Podcast. Now, before I jump into today's show, I wanted to chat real quick about two things. First, I want to give a huge thank you to Mike Stelzner from Social Media Examiner. He gave big praise for this podcast on his own show last week, as well as over on socialmediaexaminer.com. So, Mike, if you're listening, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And speaking of Social Media Examiner, they just released their annual Social Media Marketing Industry Annual Report. It's really a great look at the current state of social media marketing and where it's heading. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. You can sign up to get it over on the Social Media Examiner site. And secondly, I wanted to let you know I'm giving away a free social media review. If you're currently using social media for your business, but feel like you should be seeing better results from your efforts, I do a full review and analysis of your social media strategy and then offer you clear recommendations and improvements for growing your business. Now, this also works if you have a business and maybe don't have a social media strategy. We'll look at why you don't, and then I'll come up with a strategy for you. We'll do an hour-long Skype session to go through it all, and you'll also get a free written version of the plan. So simply email me at rick@rickmulready.com. It's rickmulready.com with the subject line review for your chance to win. Now, on to today's show. If you've heard all 12 shows or this is your first, welcome. So glad you're here. This is the show where I bring you stories and insights from the brightest minds in social media from some of the biggest brands in the world. My goal is to show you the most innovative and successful strategies that big brands are doing on social media and then how you can model them for your own business with little to no budget. Now, my guest today is Matthew Shadbolt. Matthew is the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing for the Corcoran Group. You may not have heard of the Corcoran Group, but they're the largest real estate firm in New York City, and they were started by Barbara Corcoran, who you might know from the TV show Shark Tank. I love that show here in the U.S. When I ask other guests here on the show to name a great example of a brand using social media really smartly, the Corcoran Group inevitably comes up. So super excited to share my chat here with Matthew with you. In my discussion with him, we talk about their approach to using social media to sell high-end property and why it's so successful. We talk about how they create so much valuable content and a simple plan for you guys to mirror that. Matthew gives his genius strategy for how they use Foursquare. I love this. And how they've strategically come up with thousands of pieces of helpful content. And then finally, Matthew gives his 3 tips that he'd give to a small business trying to grow their business using social media. Get ready for this one, folks. It's so full of effective strategies that you can start using right away. And I really geek out here with Matthew because there's so much great info. Let's jump right into it here with Matthew. All right, folks, we're here with Matthew Shadbolt, who's the Director of Internet Marketing for the Corcoran Group. Corcoran is the largest real estate company in New York City. Matthew, welcome to the Inside Social Media Podcast. I'm psyched to have you on today.
Hi, Rick. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what you do there at the Corcoran Group and you know what your background is, what your role is there at the company. And I'd also love to hear, if you have a team there or is it just you? And then if you do have a team, sort of what's the structure there?
Yeah, no problem. Well, my official title is the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group. And essentially, I'm responsible for anything digital that touches the customer. That's my main role at Corcoran.
Okay.
So that encompasses our website, anything we do with video, anything we do with mobile, things like listing syndication, so working with advertising partners to make sure that the properties we represent get distributed in the right places across the web. So that could involve somebody like a Zillow or a Trulia or a New York Times locally here. So distribution falls under me, and also social is a very, very large part of that, and that's we do a number of varied things that I'm sure we're going to talk about to do with that, as well as agent training, digital agent training. We have about 2,000 agents that work at Corcoran.
2,000?
2,000.
Wow.
Yep, and that's spread out across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Primarily, and we also have a fairly large presence in the east end of Long Island, the Hamptons region there, and down in Palm Beach in Florida. So we're responsible for all sort of digital training, marketing materials, and one-on-one sessions, and sort of getting our folks to adopt to a more sort of digital way of working and working with customers. And then the last thing that I'm really responsible for is any sort of experimental platform, sort of future-proofing Corcoran out for the next 5 to 10 years. And that's a really interesting space to work in, because the real estate industry is undergoing seismic changes as a result of digital, and having to keep our eye on perhaps what our customers are going to be doing when they look for real estate in the next 5 to 10 years' time, and having a presence there, or the ability to connect with them in different places. That's something that I work on a lot at Corcoran as well.
So please tell me you have a team after listing everything that you're responsible for. Please tell me it's not just you.
Yeah, I actually have a fairly small team. There's 2 people that report into me, and then we 3 are part of a larger marketing team that consists of like graphic designers and administrative assistants and the print side of the business, and things like that. So there's a larger marketing team that we're a sort of subset of, but everything digital is handled primarily by 3 people. So there's myself that sort of coordinates everything and sets the strategy, and I do a lot of the sort of hands-on work as well. And then I have what we call a specialist role, which works a lot more with the agents and does a lot of the sort of distribution and working with the ad partner stuff. And then we actually have an analyst role as well. The third position is an analyst role, and that person is essentially responsible for understanding what is currently going on. So we're a very data-driven group of 3 people here. We don't make decisions without data, essentially. And that person's main role is to help us understand the effectiveness of what we're building, to understand how we're spending our money, and essentially to answer the questions that we didn't even really know we needed to ask. So it's actually a very, very critical role. So that's sort of how it works within the larger sort of corporate environment, if you like.
Okay. And we're going to as we get into the conversation here, we're certainly going to talk about how you guys measure your social media, because I love the fact that you just said that everything that you do is data driven. And I think that's I know that's a big challenge for most anybody using social media, because it comes up as sort of the $1 million question here in almost every conversation I have here on the podcast. So let's start with social media there. And I think it's interesting that the way you talk about it is social media does not sit in a silo to what you guys are doing there from a marketing perspective. So, and I kind of think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for the real estate, industry, it tends to be sort of caught in the old ways, if you will, a little bit of, archaic in how they do things, but you guys are on the cutting edge.
Thank you.
And I don't know if you know this, but you guys, one of the questions I tend to ask my guests here on the show is, what's one example of a really, really good use of social media? And I'm going to ask you the same thing towards the end here, but what's one good example of social media, and maybe how small businesses can model it? And you guys come up as one of those, you guys have come up in more than one conversation. These, I'm talking to, to some of the biggest brands in the world. So
it's amazing to hear.
Yeah, I don't know if you know that or not, but you do now. You do know. So how do you guys use social media to sell? So the properties that you're representing are high-end properties. So how does the Corcoran Group use social media to sell those properties? And then how might small businesses be able to, apply some of those principles that you guys are using to their own business, often when they have, very minimal budgets to work with?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I mean, there's two types of customers that we have. We have buyers that we're trying to attract, and then we actually have sellers whose properties we represent. So there's two different sort of strands of the business, if you like. But essentially, your real estate is primarily it's an offline referral driven business.
Yep.
It's primarily analog in terms of the actual business that happens. But one of the things that's very important to understand in terms of the shift over the last maybe 7 or 8 years with real estate is, especially as the market has slowed, the amount of research that people do online prior to reaching out to an agent, that time period, and this is data from like the National Association of Realtors, that time period can be about 18 months to about 2 years of people doing research online where they consider themselves to be in the market.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And places like Google and Zillow and Trulia and the big syndication portals, they become very, very important part of that process. But also, people aren't necessarily looking for those specific types of searches until they're very deep into the process. A lot of what they do before that is things like researching neighborhoods and understanding where exactly they want to live, whether they're, whether it has the amenities nearby that they would like, or that, offers the kind of things that they'd be interested in, or whether it's near the bars that they enjoy and things like that. So what happens is we are very, very focused with social on where people are spending time online. It's not necessarily about the direct connection with the customer in terms of direct lead generation. Mm-hmm. The path of the customer is sort of inherently, it's not a straight line. Let me put that. The path of the customer is sort of all over the place when it comes to real estate. They look at one thing, and then they'll look at a completely different thing, and then they begin to narrow their choices. And what happens is the more time we can generate with our content, even if it's recreational, so much the better. And that approach allows us to connect with customers who are not yet in the market, but eventually become customers. So the greater the level of connection, what actually happens is that the more aggressive we've become in social media and the greater a connection we've made with a greater amount of people, what happens is that when people actually come to do those searches inside a Google or a Zillow or Trulia or somebody like that, we actually, our results that have the little Corcoran logo next to them and the thumbnail picture, mm-hmm. they start to resonate more with the customer because the customer understands that it's a brand that they recognize. So essentially, the social media thing is a search play for us.
Okay.
And what happens is the more aggressive we've been in social over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, there's a direct connection to an aggressive lift in organic search results, either back into our own site or just people that work with Corcoran listings on other sites.
Okay.
Time spent with Corcoran listings on other sites is still valuable time with us, even if they bypass our website and connect with an agent without even coming to our own site. The main goal of this is to connect customers with agents, as you would imagine.
Sure.
So social plays a key role in making all of that happen.
Yeah, and so I have tons of questions. That's such great information, and my mind is just going a million miles a minute right now. So my first question there is, can you give us an example of the type of content that you guys are providing? Because your sales cycle, if you will, is so long, as you said, and it's that that lead time, that long lead time that goes into it. So when people are researching neighborhoods and schools and so forth. What type of content are you putting out there from a social perspective?
Yeah, a great example of what you're talking about is what we do with Foursquare. We have an approach of using Foursquare, and that it's incredibly popular here in New York. Foursquare, obviously, those guys are from New York.
Yeah.
And what we've built over the past 3 or 4 years with Foursquare is an enormous inventory of localized tips that are generated from our agents. So we'll interview an agent for 15 minutes or something like that, and we extract sort of what's inside their head. So an agent that's been working a particular neighborhood for 15 or 20 years, they know the secret spots, how to cut the line, where the deals are, all this stuff that only a real local would know.
Sure.
And agents are really, really good at that stuff. And what we do is we've created a database of almost 3,000 localized pieces of information that now live as our presence within Foursquare. So what happens is when people are checking in, and especially when they use the Explore feature of Foursquare, Corcoran has a very, very localized, context-specific presence when people are exploring neighborhoods or deciding where to go to eat tonight or thinking about what to do at the weekend and things like that. And that's a really good example of how we've been able to generate enormous brand awareness locally and also outside of our market. When people come to visit New York, they understand that Corcoran understands what life in Manhattan and Brooklyn is like more than anybody else, and that's a very big brand goal for us. Is owning local expertise, and we do that by using sort of local social mobile platforms like Foursquare is a good example of that.
Can you give us a specific example of how that might work?
Of a particular tip?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be the specific business, but
Sure.
just like what's an example of a type of tip that you might give?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share our most popular one. We
Sure.
we have a place in New York called the Shake Shack, and it's notorious for its long lines. It's a burger joint, essentially, in Madison Square Park. And in the summer, the lines can be up to an hour or even 90 minutes for their burgers and their ice creams.
Better be a good burger.
Believe me, that is one of the best burgers you'll ever have. And it's very famous for its long line.
Okay.
And our tip at the Shake Shack is a tip about how to cut the line, which essentially says, if you're here just for ice cream, look for the signs that say, the B line instead of the A line, and you can cut straight through, and you can be out of there in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
And it's a very, very popular tip, but it's something that only a real local would know.
Gotcha.
Because most people, the line is 100 people long and it's 90 minutes. So,
right.
If you're just there for a certain type of thing, this is how it works. And it's a very, very popular tip. Like hundreds of people have saved it and used it and added it to lists and shared it and things like that.
So someone checks in to the Shake Shack and they get your tip.
Yeah, I mean they don't even need to check in. I mean, if they check in, it'll pop up on their phone. But even when they're using Explore, even if they're not followers of Corcoran, they still see the popular tips at those venues, which has been great for us.
Okay, so is that a paid strategy, or is that something? I'm trying to sort of narrow that down to see what type of is that something that can be modeled by a small business maybe who doesn't really have any budget to do that, but it's a brilliant idea because the important thing to pull out of there too is that you're not advertising, if you will, a property. I mean, you're just adding value to people within the city.
Right. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot at Corcoran is that the product, very often the product that we have is the service that our agents provide. Homes is sort of selling a home and an apartment. That's actually the result for the customer.
Mm-hmm.
But the service and the value that we provide is helping people through the process of moving within New York. That's actually what we do. And a lot of what we talk about at the brand level, and every time we do, customer surveys and things like that, our customers always tell us the same thing, which is that when they look for an apartment in New York, what is around the building is just as much as important to the process as what's inside the apartment. Mm-hmm. And it's something we sort of characterize as going beyond the four walls. That's what we call it internally. And this strategy of populating localized knowledge around the city in a very sort of aggressive way, that's a very key part of helping people understand that if you had a question about life in the city, we are an available and hopefully helpful and insightful resource for that.
Sure.
Because nobody really does it better than an agent that's been working in a particular neighborhood for a long period of time.
Sure. So was that Sorry, go ahead.
To answer your question, it's not paid.
Oh, okay.
It's really an investment of time,
okay,
which of course is not free.
Sure.
But there's no monetary investment into what we're doing there. It's simply us adding maybe 8 to 10 different tips a week, but we've been doing it for 3+ years.
Right.
So over time, you end up with this enormously powerful inventory of localized information. Essentially, we went out and built our own Zagat survey. That's essentially what we did. And a lot of the work was essentially making sure that those tips surface in the right place at the right time for the right person.
Yeah.
And as Foursquare has evolved, what they're actually starting to work on is different types of tips surfacing based on things like the weather or the time of day and things like that. So we're very sort of focused on that thing now.
Okay.
So, Times Square, for example, is a very different place in the morning than it is in the evening. So the nature of the local advice that you would give needs to sort of be flexible with that as well. Your tip is going to be different in the morning than it is perhaps at lunchtime or when it rains or when it snows. And so what you can end up with is a strategy that actually needs to multiply around localized advice. And that's something that we're working on right now is how we surface the right thing at the right time, because we have this enormous inventory, but very often, what we were finding is that we'd get the amazing rooftop bar suggestion surfacing in December, and that kind of thing is like, well, that doesn't feel right.
Right.
So making sure that we edit and sort of curate our own database based around those environmental factors, and that's been a lot of fun to work on.
So I think the key there, Matthew, is that it's not, it's you guys have been working on this for a few years now, and it's not something like, you've just put together 3,000 of them right now. You've taken, this is a collaboration over a period of time, and you've just done a little bit each week and built up this database. And it's not something that has cost you money. It's cost you in the way of time. So this is something that, any small business can do, and you're adding value to people. I think that's a very key thing that we're talking about here is you're not going for the sale, I mean, it would be very difficult to because of the market that you're in with the high end real estate, but you're not going for the sale right away. You're adding value to people and branding yourselves that way. So, we've talked about
that's very important.
Yeah, we've talked about Foursquare. So, one of the biggest challenges I hear from readers and listeners is they're overwhelmed with all the social media options out there. And they think they need to be on every platform chasing the latest shiny social tool. And, ultimately that causes their social media efforts to be wasted because they really, they haven't really gone deep on one or two platforms. So you guys are on several platforms. You've mentioned Foursquare, you're on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Pinterest. How did you guys figure out which platforms to be on, especially because your audience is very diverse? You have many different types of people. So how did you guys figure that out? And then how do you recommend that small businesses go about finding where their customers are in social media? And then likewise, how might they decide whether they should use any new tools as they come out?
That's it. Yeah, let me take each one of those in turn there.
Sure.
It's in terms of how we choose what to do, we are we're ruthless editors when it comes to platform adoption, and also how we use those things. It's essentially how we create content for them.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually started our first ever social platform was Twitter. And the way that we think about this stuff is we only really adopt a platform if it solves a business question for us. And one of the things that we had initially started to talk about was that it was very difficult for us to talk to people online. It's very difficult, and for example, it's very thorny to add comments to property pages, for example.
Right.
There's a relationship with the seller and things like that. So commenting isn't something that we can do on our website necessarily. So one of the things that we said was, we're sort of living and breathing this localized insight brand and things like that, but we weren't really living that stuff online. So we said, well, we need some kind of venue to be able to talk to the people that we want to connect with, which is either potential customers, other New Yorkers, or even other people within the real estate industry. Because essentially, like I said before, we're a referral-based organization, and connecting with other members of the real estate industry is very important. So that's why we started with Twitter, because it essentially became an open door to ask Corcoran anything.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, when you think of a luxury high-end brand, it isn't necessarily known, any type of brand like that. It isn't known for openness and transparency of information. Usually it's a pretty sort of closed door type thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a really big step for Corcoran to take that. And it's been incredibly powerful for us. I still think Twitter is one of the most powerful things that we do online, because it allows people to ask us anything, and it allows us to participate in conversations. It allows us to do things like thought leadership. It allows us to share really what's going on and what we're building and what our agents are doing and the kind of things that we're interested in.
Sure.
And then, as we started to sort of curate a little bit more content, we actually have, very often we have the content curation versus creation kind of conversation with people.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have we usually have the opposite problem from most folks, because we have too much information very often in New York. So there's so much going on here that it becomes more of an issue of curation of what we're going to share and finding the best stuff rather than what am I going to post today.
Yeah.
So as we started to curate and share more visual things and videos and things like that, we actually found that Facebook offered sort of a good solution for sharing more visual things in a way that Twitter was conversational. We found that photos, would be a little bit more appropriate for something like a news feed. And I think as Facebook has evolved, we've definitely seen that really take hold. I think we sort of almost exclusively post photos only now.
Sure.
Because they perform the best, they have the highest engagement, things, the most sharing, things like that. So Facebook was a natural evolution of what we were really doing on Twitter in terms of, sharing things to do in New York and things like that. And then as we started to get more and more people connect with us, we were starting to be asked lots of different questions, like where did you get the best cupcake, or who has the best pizza in Manhattan or Brooklyn, or what's the difference between a condo and a co-op, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was about life in New York or something to do with the industry, or any kind of knowledge about the markets that we work in. And what was happening was we were answering those things on a fairly regular basis, but there was no real way to archive them. There was no real way to say, here's a vast bank of answers that we have about what we do. And that, we said, well, we want to sort of humanize that a little bit. Instead of it just being like an archive that you would type something in and search, we want to humanize that process a little bit. And that actually became what we do on YouTube. We still do like the property videos and the tours and the walkthroughs and that kind of stuff, but it really isn't a focus of ours on YouTube. Primarily what we do is people that work at Corcoran, whether they're agents or members of the staff or something, answering questions and sharing insight personally about Manhattan and Brooklyn.
So you guys took all this information, this vast amount of information, and you're like you said, you're humanizing it, and you're just having people answer it in a real short video.
And we filmed it. Yeah,
I love it.
And a lot of that process of having an agent say, what's the best thing to do in New York when it rains, and answering that in like a 50-second to 1 minute kind of clip, that allows us to start answering the things that we were beginning to see in Foursquare. So when it begins to rain in Manhattan, as it's been doing today, that video surfaces more aggressively, and you start to see it more inside of Twitter, or you'll see it in what we do in Tumblr, or that kind of stuff. And most importantly, was about the same time we were starting to work a lot more with mobile apps and location targeting and things like that. So what happens is we were able to create our own app for searching Corcoran properties. So when somebody is searching for an apartment in Soho, for example, whether they're physically in Soho or whether they're just looking for Soho listings and they're somewhere else, what happens is there's a small module that appears at the bottom of the screen of a Corcoran person talking to you about something to do with Soho, whether that's where to get the best dinner, or how the market is, or anything in between. But it's a person talking to you on the phone. And mobile video views have been something that we've seen a lot of engagement and use of.
Sure.
Most of our video views come in some form in a mobile way.
Yeah.
So the videos that we did in YouTube were always really geared towards being used either in social or in mobile. We don't really think of our channel as a destination. Our channel is more of just a place to kind of store all that stuff.
Sure.
You can browse it, but we have playlists, and you can browse that stuff if you want, but that isn't really where the viewership is. So that's sort of how, like, the conversational aspects of Twitter, the visual curation of Facebook, and the mobile video humanized answers of YouTube all kind of fit together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key there is that you didn't just jump in to every single platform and start using it. You strategically looked at it and said, okay, this is what we need to accomplish. Which platform does that? And then, you figured that out on that platform, and then went on to the next one. So this is my problem here. Now, which platform, fixes that, or not fixes it, but achieves that?
Right. And there's a lot that we say no to. We don't have a blog. And there's a lot of platforms that we don't, we might sort of sit back and say, well, let's see what happens with this. This might be interesting to us. Very often we've been asked, what is Corcoran going to do with Vine, for example? And we say, well, right now we're not doing anything with Vine. We're sort of happy to listen and watch, and we're very interested in sort of non-real estate brands as well, and sort of looking at what perhaps like Coca-Cola might do with Vine, or the great example that I saw recently was MLB are doing great stuff with Vine.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing sort of like almost like virtual baseball cards inside it. It's
That's
very,
really
very
cool.
Yeah, super cool. And we're looking at that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there's a lot that we say no to. But a lot of what we are able to do quite easily is apply an existing approach to a new platform. So, for example, what we were doing on Facebook in terms of sharing, amazing photos of New York or amazing pictures of our properties or things like that, that's actually quite easy to scale into something like Pinterest, for example. Yeah. So we just say, well, here's a huge group of amazing kitchens, or here's a huge group of things on the Upper West Side. And it just allows us to do sort of an expanded version of what we've been doing on Facebook anyway.
Sure.
And we're more, but in terms of Pinterest specifically, we're actually more interested in what's being pinned from in terms of Corcoran content elsewhere on the web.
Yeah.
We're very interested in seeing what other people are sharing, and that in many ways sort of guides what we do. We're actually guided by how and what people are sharing of ours elsewhere online, and we're able to go in and see that in Pinterest, which is
Sure.
very, very helpful.
So you're listening. You're using these platforms to listen to what people are saying, what people are seeing, what people are doing, and then reacting accordingly. So, and I think another key thing there, Matthew, is that the content that you guys are creating is, it doesn't. I mean, of course, a lot of it is high end, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, you can just take your, any small business can take their smartphone with a video camera on it and shoot a high quality video, especially with the quality of the smartphones these days.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that we know New Yorkers are very, very passionate about is food. Who has, where to eat and what to order and what the specials are and things like that. New Yorkers are incredibly passionate about that stuff. So pictures of amazing food do very, very well for us.
Yeah.
And they really help. They help to visualize and explain a piece of localized information. It's one thing for us to say, the Shake Shack has an amazing burger, but it's something else to say, and here's what it looks like. It makes it feel like we actually did it,
right?
And it sort of makes it a little bit more realistic.
Right.
And of course, when you see something like that in a news feed, there's a big difference between something that has a picture and something that doesn't.
Sure. So, Matthew, let's do a little fill in the blank here. So, two
Sure.
words: social media is more about blank than about blank.
Oh boy, I saw this in your notes before before the podcast.
Yeah.
This is a real tough one. I mean, very often I've heard that, listening is more important than publishing, for example. I've heard that a lot. But one of the things that I think is very often missed with these things is that social media, it's about the long burn more than the quick hit, I think.
Yep.
And that's sort of how we feel about it, is that we think that, while it's wonderful that people connect with us and they say, oh, I love what Corcoran is doing, it's been a sort of 5-year process for us to get to the point where we feel like we're sort of connecting on a way that we're sort of comfortable with. It's a very long burn, social media, and we did almost everything wrong along the way. From all the bad advice we could, we did it all bad, but eventually there's enough good things and how to connect with people and things that do work over time that you actually start to be able to scale the thing effectively and grow into new platforms and things like that. So I think very often people miss the fact that this is a cumulative process.
Mm-hmm. It's
that 8 to 10 tips a week, but it's having the discipline to do it every single week.
Sure.
And that's a real challenge for some organizations, I think, is just the discipline to keep going with it.
Yeah.
Because they say, this isn't working, or, I tried Tumblr and it didn't work for me. Well, Tumblr for us, for example, is our largest social platform. And for the first, I would say, 3 years of what we were doing on Tumblr, we had very, very low engagement levels, and then all of a sudden it took off. And now we have, more than 100,000 subscribers on Tumblr. But it was because we stuck at it and we believed in what we were doing, and it fitted with everything else that we were thinking about.
Yeah, that was my question there. So it did fit with what you were doing. So is that why you kept at it? Because within the first 3 years, if you do have low engagement, it's like you said, many businesses, both small and large, would probably look at that and say, okay, we tried it for a couple of years, the engagement isn't quite there, so we're going to, abandon that and try something else. So what was the reason that you guys kept at it?
Well, we're big believers in the platform.
Okay.
And it's been an interesting couple of weeks in terms of Tumblr's acquisition by Yahoo, in terms of people asking us about how Tumblr works. Tumblr is sort of it's a little bit of a blind spot within the real estate industry. There aren't really many real estate organizations that use it.
Mm-hmm.
We are very, very big supporters of that kind of organization within New York. So Tumblr are obviously from New York, Foursquare are from New York. People like Food Spotting have a base in New York, things like that. And we're really interested in connecting with those kinds of startups, essentially. And so we've had a relationship with Tumblr for some time now. And we started to think, well, what would we do? WordPress? Would we do some kind of expanded form of what we're doing on Facebook? And Tumblr was just a really neat fit for doing something that we really wanted to do, which was a property of the day. We wanted to create something where we would be able to showcase one amazing thing every single day. And the reason that we chose Tumblr was because it allows us it's very nimble, is mobile optimized, and it has enormous local audience in New York. But behind all of that stuff was a plan to create that as an iPad app. We wanted to create something a little bit different that wasn't perhaps like search-centric, and create this amazing sort of magazine-like property of the day product for a tablet. And the iPad was very, very new, and we said, well, let's use Tumblr to experiment with what types of properties, perhaps the order of the images, what other information we might put associated with each listing, whether we, perhaps incorporate the Foursquare stuff with it. Do we want to put a video next to it, explain that kind of stuff? So Tumblr was a huge testing ground that allowed us to understand what types of visual content and visual curation would really resonate with people prior to, using that kind of insight elsewhere. And it ended up as a tablet app for us.
Okay. So
that's how we think about those things. So Tumblr is like this huge sandpit that we kind of play in. It just happened to coincide with enormous growth of Tumblr itself. And, we were picked up as like a featured Tumblr, and over time, we've managed to grow an enormous subscription base there. Gotcha. So, Matthew, we're coming up on time here, but there's a couple questions that I've got to ask you because, I could talk to you for hours here, and I'm sure we could go on for the rest of the afternoon. No problem.
So I do want to know, everything that you're talking about is creating great content and adding that value. But, in the end, you guys, are about selling properties. So how do you measure all of this? How does Corcoran measure all of your social media efforts?
Well, one of the things that we do is there is a follow-up after the sale about where the customer originated.
Okay.
So that's one way that we can track it. However, that process is a little foggy in terms of how that works, because it's like trying to remember the first time you had a Coke.
Right.
Like, well, I know I'm a Coke person and not a Pepsi person, but I don't really remember seeing 20 different types of ads or seeing their Facebook page, or I just remember the thing that got me to the agent. Like
Sure.
It's like that kind of stuff. So very often, one of the things that we look at is volume of agent contact. How many people are directly reaching out to agents, either on a daily basis or weekly or monthly basis? And that's really the search play that I talked about earlier. So the more of that we can generate, and social directly fuels that. There's a direct connection between social and search for us.
Okay.
And so that's the key kind of criteria at which it leaves kind of the work that we do and becomes about the connection between the agent and the customer. So the more we generate through social and search and other sort of online venues, and the more time people spend with our content, the greater the degree of actual agent outreach.
Sure.
Now, the other side of that is what we can offer to prospective sellers in terms of reach. Very often, we'll work with an agent to say, how can you help me promote this particular property in the widest possible, most competitive way online? And we'll say, well, we can offer you a YouTube video, a Pinterest board, a dedicated Pinterest board just for that property. Or we'll surface you in our mobile apps when people search within that particular neighborhood. Or we'll promote you as our featured property of the day in our proprietary iPad app or Facebook or Tumblr. And the range of what we can offer to our sellers greatly expands. And it becomes very, very attractive to people that want to do business with us.
Yeah, because it's a result of all your cumulative work, and the breadth and scope of what you guys have built has become basically a positioning and a selling tool for people looking to list properties in New York. And you guys can say, that's really cool. You guys can say, look, this is what we can offer you guys because we have the scope and reach of these properties.
That's very true. It becomes much more about what you can offer that's different from the competition, because every listing information in general is sort of been commoditized already. You can really get all listings everywhere now. So it becomes about, additional things on top of that. And there's a big difference between the agent that goes in to pitch a potential client. One of them has a manila folder full of 50 sheets of paper, and one of them goes in there and says, I can put your property in front of thousands of people on our iPad every day.
Right.
There's a really big difference between those two things in the seller's mind.
Sure.
I think.
Absolutely. Especially when we're talking about, the high-end properties that you guys are representing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all aspects of the market, for sure. Yeah.
Sure. So, Matthew, two questions here to wrap up, and let's bullet it out here. So, as we've talked about, small businesses obviously don't have the kind of marketing and social media budget that big brands do. So, with that in mind, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit, let's bullet it out here. What are top 3 tips that you would give to a small business trying to grow their business using social media?
It's a really good question because it's very difficult to narrow it down to 3. But I'll take my own advice and say the first one is you have to focus. You have to focus. You've got to start small and grow it, and it's a cumulative thing. So focus is really, really important.
Okay.
I also think that it's number 2. I would say is absolutely critical to listen, because a lot of people make the mistake of jumping in and sort of doing a sort of spray and pray publishing approach, especially on things like Twitter and Facebook, where their content just dissolves into the news feed. But the ability to actually listen and understand the types of things that resonate with those types of users and how different the users are per platform. Like Pinterest people are completely different from Instagram people.
Sure.
Or, and Twitter people, they comment in a completely different way than YouTube people, things like that. So focus and listening. And number 3, I would sort of just reiterate one of the things that I'd said before is stick with it. It's a cumulative process of slowly building an enormous thing over time. And that's been an approach that's been really beneficial to us. And I think that's applicable to any size business, is to start small and grow it. Make the mistakes along the way, but be nimble enough to be able to adjust. And don't sort of lock into one particular approach. The great thing about social is that it's so flexible, and the platforms change so much throughout the year. Like Facebook is a completely different type of beast than it was a year ago, for example. And there's so many sort of opportunities that get thrown at you that if you don't have that sort of focus and sort of dedication to what your particular sort of competitive strand is, you can really get kind of muddled and confused, I think. And just, try to sort of understand what people that you would be interested in do. So, for example, like the kinds of brands that I would like, I don't try to sort of copy them, but I take things that I enjoy about all these sort of non-real estate brands, and I try to apply it to what we do at Corcoran. It's like, well, that was a lot of fun for me. How can I make that resonate for the hundreds of thousands of people that are connected to our brand?
Sure. That's a key point there, that you don't have to necessarily look at and model other companies or brands within your specific industry. You can see what other brands are doing. And
we actually rarely do that. We're much more interested in what Ford might be doing, or ESPN, or whatever other brand. We're just really interested in like interesting work that's being done in
Sure.
social, and that's not confined to the real estate vertical at all, I think.
Sure. Well, you have to listen to episode number 1 with Scott Monty from Ford. He was my first guest here on the show.
Yeah, he's really great.
He's awesome.
Really, really great. Yeah, he's doing great stuff over there.
Yeah, he really is. So, Matthew, let's finish up here with last question. So you mentioned at the very beginning that part of your responsibilities there at Corcoran is to look at, what's trending, where are things heading. So what do you think the trends are in social media that you're seeing over the next year or so? And then how do you see these trends affecting small business?
Well, one of the things that we're very focused on right now, which we think is actually going to be more and more important as more content gets published to these platforms. The amount of sharing, what do they call it? Is it like Zuckerberg's law? The amount of sharing that's going on is doubling every year. And as more content gets published to these platforms, I think it's going to be it's going to be very critical to understand 4 things. The right content in the right place at the right time for the right person. And if you can surface what you're doing in a way that hits those 4 particular things, then I think you resonate more with the potential customer.
Sure.
So, I mentioned an approach where, we were surfacing things in Foursquare, but one of the things that we're actively working on with Twitter is to use a service called If This Then That.
I've heard about that just recently.
Yeah, it's a really, really great service that allows you to. It's what they call a trigger-based service that says, when I upload a picture to Instagram, I want to push it to Facebook, for example. Or when somebody sends me a text message, send it to my email. And there's a bunch of services that work with this. But one of them is the weather. And you can say, when it begins to snow in Manhattan, send a tweet that says, here's Corcoran's favorite hot chocolate in the city. And we're starting to connect those 2 things, where it isn't us physically tweeting it, but the tweet is triggered by something that's actually happening environmentally.
I love that.
So it might be that it's weather. It might be the time of day. So it might be, say, 6 o'clock, for example, and we'll say, okay, it's 6 o'clock and you're making dinner. Why not dream bigger with our Pinterest kitchen boards? It's
Gotcha.
like that kind of thing, where we start to connect the dots between the context of what somebody might be doing with content that we already have at the right time.
Yeah.
And we're starting to use video like that as well. So we are, when it rains in Manhattan, here's an agent talking about her favorite movie theaters and museums to go to on a rainy day, like things like that. And so I think, surfacing appropriate context is going to be very, very important. And a lot of people, like on Facebook, for example, I think there's a huge opportunity in things like Twitter and Facebook to use that kind of stuff more effectively. I mean, we've seen incredible levels of engagement where we've actually created something in Facebook that's been timely. And I think the recent example of all of this is obviously what Oreo did in the Super Bowl, where it was so timely and they were so nimble that they had this enormous response to something that was incredibly appropriate to post. So we're sort of working with that kind of idea, and it's not an easy thing to build, essentially, because you have to have the nimbleness to be able to do that. You also is dependent on having the available inventory of things to be able to use.
Sure.
And the means to actually implement it in a way that reacts to something.
Yeah.
So I think those kind of things are going to be what we see brands do a lot more over the next sort of year to 18 months, I think.
So cool. I mean, I love that stuff, and I geek out about it. So,
well, you can have a lot of fun with it because, we're starting to say, well, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. Here's our favorite pizza places.
Right,
and
right.
we start to kind of talk to the customer in a way that they might the stuff's gonna surface at the right time, but in a
Sure.
fun way.
Yeah, it's the crown jewel of marketing.
Right.
That's awesome. Matthew, oh man, I seriously could talk to you for hours here. But where can people connect with you and with the Corcoran Group online?
Well, we're at Corcoran.com. That's our website. And if you want to stop by and say hi, I'd love to speak to anyone. I'm always happy to chat on Twitter. I'm at Corcoran_group on Twitter. And that's a great place to just say hello.
Okay. I will be sure to link those links up in the show notes for today's show. And Matthew, man, so thankful that you could join us on the show today. Such good information. Really appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me today, Rick.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Man, I could have chatted with Matthew for hours. So much great information. Now, if you like the podcast, I'd be extremely grateful if you help get the word out about it. I've created a really easy way for you to do that too. Just go to rickmulready.com/share. That's rickmulready.com/share. And that will auto-populate a tweet that you can send out on Twitter about the show. It's a really easy way to spread the word about the show. And the more people that we can help with the show, the better. So I'd really appreciate that. Now for today's show notes, you can visit rickmulready.com/episode 12. Next week, I have another awesome show lined up for you. So until then, keep rocking and have a great week. And I could have chatted with Matthew for hours. So much great information. Now, if you like the podcast, I'd be extremely grateful if you help get the word out about it. I've created a